There you go.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Michigan Watercolor Society Art Talk Zoom call for this month. And with us, our special guest today is Clayton Lewis. And Clayton is the curator of graphic materials at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. And he holds a BFA from Swain School of Design and an MFA from Parsons School of Design, which is in New York. He's worked as an adjunct faculty to the University of Michigan School of Art in the field of commercial printing before becoming the first curator of graphic material at the Clements in 2002. He's authored numerous articles and curator of exhibitions on various historical subjects, including vernacular photography, early radical satire, popular and patriotic music, wartime art, and American leisure travel. So I connected with Clayton because for those of you that don't know, his father, Professor William Lewis, was also very active with Michigan Watercolor in the day. I didn't know him, but we have a few people on this call that do or did, and they're still alive, which is beautiful. And so before we get started, Clayton, I'd like Angie Miller to tell us a little bit about the experience with your dad.
So Bill was on my board when I was president of the Watercolor Society. And I like to joke, but it's sort of true, that he was my saving grace when somebody on the board was driving me crazy. He just calmed me down, says, it's okay, it's all right. He did his job, and he was sort of that middle person in the whole society that kept things flowing. So that's my best memory of him. We used to drive back and forth together to the board meetings. And so I got to hear a little bit about what Clayton was doing or Garland was doing or different people, so that it really turned out to be a very special time for me. And I believe he was on the board a number of years before that as an early board member. But he came back on, this would have been in the 80s, he came back on and worked with the board for 3 years. So the whole time I was president, that was great.
That's great. My goal as president myself has been, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Rocco Pisto. I'm president of the Michigan Watercolor Society for the last 5 years, and this is my final exhibition season as president. And I've enjoyed doing things like this. This kind of came about because of COVID and we weren't getting together. So I started Zoom calls with people I wanted to know more about, members, other artists that do a lot of workshops around the country, people that could bring value to the organization from their experience and just kind of hearing what they have to say. So and one of my missions as president was going back to our roots. This organization was started in 1946 by professors at Wayne State, U of M, people from the DIA, the Scarab Club, and other businesses in the Detroit area, and started an organization to focus on water media and water media artists and promoting them. And we've kept it alive. And so someone else just joined. There we go. So this is just one of the things that we've come up with to keep you informed. So Clayton, with that, I think we'll let you get started and go from there.
Thank you, Rocco. I've been looking forward to this talk, and because obviously I admire my father and his work. I'm a huge fan and always have been. And the Michigan Watercolor Society meant a lot to him. He was very proud of his membership and his activity, and watercolor painting was central to him to his work as an artist from the beginning to the end, which I'll show you. And he hadn't been active as an artist in the last years of his life, which is probably why a lot of the current membership doesn't remember my father, but he was certainly very proud of his membership. So I'm going to start a screen share here, and hopefully this will work.
And if anybody wants the newsletter that we offer quarterly, we did one about a year ago that my wife, Vicky, the historian, wrote an article that included various stories and things that we could find, as well as Angie's comments about that experience as well. So just let me know.
So after my father passed away in 2020, it sort of hit me that he had been active as an artist across 8 decades, which is really quite spectacular in and of itself.
It is, yes.
Okay. As far as I know, he started watercolor painting in the 1930s, but I am not certain of this. The earliest watercolor painting I can point to with a date is this one, and it was dated 1940. My father at this point was coming into the University of Michigan to study engineering, and he had a watercolor painting class at the art school with Ernest Harrison Barnes, who apparently was a very good watercolor instructor near the end of his career.
I've never seen
And my father was unaware of the existence of the school, he said, when he came and enrolled at the University of Michigan. But while he was a student, a couple of momentous things happened in his life. One of them was the discovery of the art school, and the other was the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Here's my father's student ID. I came across this going through his papers. But my father was in the Navy Reserves for several years prior to World War II, and he knew it was only a matter of time. And he was called up after Pearl Harbor in 1942, having really completed 1 year of college. He was stationed at Pearl Harbor after the attack on board the USS Marcasite, which was a patrol vessel, and then later USS Shangri-La, one of the fleet aircraft carriers in the Pacific Theater. He was part of Admiral Halsey's massive Third Fleet, which entered Tokyo Bay in 1945. And he brought his watercolor kit with him throughout the war. There are about 220 paintings that he did during the war that are now at the Clements Library as part of our World War II resources. And they are remarkably accomplished and confident. And I have to keep reminding myself when I look at them that this was the work of a student that had one watercolor class. He sketched naval actions from memory, but also events from observation during the war. This is a specific attack depicted, but I'm sure this was painted after the event from memory, as they no doubt were at battle stations during the attack. This would have been off of Okinawa in 1945. My father, always interested in history, documented exactly which ships appear in the paintings. And there's very often a date and a time written on the back of the paintings. The United States fleet was decimated by a couple of typhoons during World War II. This was painted not from memory, but from the conning tower of the aircraft carrier Shangri-La during one of these typhoons. I think this might be my favorite painting of the entire series. There also are thumbnail sketches that were done inside the ship during this time as the crew were shoring up the hangar doors on the exterior of the vessel to protect them from the incoming waves. And this painting, my father, I was surprised to find out that that he carried oil paints during the war as well. In one of his letters home to his parents, he mentions being asked to do portraits of officers on the ship and in oil. And this painting is an oil painting, and this one does have a specific time and a place. It's dated August 15th, 1945, and this is the day that hostilities ceased, when Admiral Nimitz and Hazley declared an end to the fighting. And my father described how you could hear the joyous shouts and the bands playing for miles across the water. They were 50 miles off of Japan when the end of the war came. My father had some shore leave in Japan in the aftermath of the war and did these sketches in the Yokohama area of the burned out cities. These are very formative experiences, I'm certain. My father was very much a pacifist as long as I knew him, but was also very proud of his military service. But to see firsthand the destruction of the war, I'm sure had a big effect on him. So after the war, he returned to the University of Michigan, completed his degree in art, graduating in 1948, and got a job working for the university at the Willow Run research laboratories, where he was a technical illustrator. He needed a security clearance for the work he was doing. And I remember at some point during the 1990s, he got a letter from the federal government telling him that his security clearance had been revoked. And he thought that was hilariously funny that he had gone that many years with an active security clearance, but didn't know it. And in 1950, he met my mother, Ethel Caderna, and they met at the Haven Hall fire on the campus of the University of Michigan, according to the family lore. And watercolor paintings in the 1950s, this is an example of it's almost a caricature of a Victorian house is the way I like to look at it, but it's done in pen and ink and watercolor in a very loose and freewheeling style that is just delightful. This is a crayon thumbnail sketch that I discovered in his papers recently, and I recognized it immediately as a compositional study for a larger watercolor painting, which is this one. This one titled Emerald City. It hung in my grandparents' house for many years, but on the back of the painting, it was marked that this was entered into the 1955 Michigan Watercolor Society exhibit, and it won a prize. It won the AAA Frame Shop Studio Prize for that year, and then ended up in the possession of my father's parents. And my son Chris has it now, but it's a wonderful, fanciful view. And when I saw that pencil sketch, I knew immediately what it was. A very familiar painting.
Well, it looked futuristic from the 50s concepts. So that was amazing.
This one's from the early 60s. A plein air watercolor done. I'm not sure if this is Cape Cod or Maine. This might be Highland Light out on Cape Cod, where we did a lot of vacations on the East Coast. And it's got a wonderful freshness to it and spontaneity. My dad liked his Prussian blue, a color that I don't often use, but he leaned on it pretty heavily. Crimson also is another color that he had on his palette quite often that you'll notice. in the 1950s, and as I mentioned, this connection kind of happened through the Potters Guild. There was a time when my father had a business called Corporate Designers with his friends Harvey Littleton and Ari Lotti, and they did graphic design and industrial design, and their building was 512 South Main Street. The building is still there. And they had the upstairs, and in the downstairs was a pottery workshop that was run by a little club that at the time were calling themselves the Goat's Nest, but they would later become the Ann Arbor Potters Guild. And the membership of that organization included Beth Littleton and Dorothy Cahill. And through this organization, my father became acquainted with James Cahill, a student at the University of Michigan who would go on to become one of the premier historians of Chinese art. And Cahill and my father became good friends, and James Cahill gave my father lessons in Chinese brush painting. And he had an ulterior motive. Cahill wanted to fake a Chinese scroll, and he was looking for somebody that had the chops to do it. Cahill had the knowledge of ancient Chinese painting, but didn't have the brushwork. My father could do the brushwork. And so through Cahill, my father learned the styles and techniques of the Chinese masters. And these are some practice pieces that he did during this time. This relationship went on for years. James Cahill, during his travels in Asia, would buy my father brushes and inks and paper and send them back with specific instructions on what technique is meant for which brush. And this is another practice piece done during that time. And what this led up to was this scroll, which was a gift to the historian Max Luhr, who was teaching art history at the University of Michigan at the time. He would later go on to Harvard. And the scroll represents the styles of several well-known Chinese masters all on one scroll, complete with faked contemporaneous commentary by Chinese philosophers and collectors and their faked stamps. And this was never meant to be deceptive. It was meant to be a practical joke. And certainly you can see my father's inclusions of a classic William Lewis freight train rolling through the countryside gave clear evidence from the very beginning that this was not to be taken too seriously. The wrapper of the scroll also had a 20th century zipper enclosing it, just to make it clear. Professor Luhr loved the scroll, and he gave it back to the University of Michigan when he retired.
How long are they, Clayton?
This one is like about 12 feet long if you were to
Okay.
unroll
That's what
the
I
entire
thought.
thing. You know, it's kind of a masterpiece of tomfoolery, but the whole process, I think, gave my father an awful lot of confidence with the brush, and what he had learned about Chinese brush painting, I think, carried forth into some of his other artwork. This is an ink drawing from 1955 called Patriots Dream, and it's not at all in a Chinese style. You know, it's a much more of an expressionistic style, but yet I have to believe much of this work with ink on paper that he was doing with Cahill was informing his work in this style as well. And even some of his work in oils. You know, this was the era of abstract expressionism, and this large oil canvas titled Red Planet, to some degree, has that confident brushwork that I think comes out of all of that time spent with Chinese ink. This is from the early 60s, another big abstract piece. It was done, I think, in 1961 or 62. The title of the painting is 1942. My father, always conscious of history and his own role in it, is looking back at his war experiences And I believe that this painting specifically references an incident in the war that was a confrontation with a German U-boat in the Caribbean, and a depth charge attack from the patrol boat that he was on that I think went very badly for both sides. And the small vessel that my father was on survived the attack, but went in for repairs at San Diego afterwards. Those of you that knew my dad probably remember his sense of humor. He had a very wry wit, and it comes through in his paintings as well. This is an abstract oil from 1962 titled Classified. Here he is in the 1960s, relaxing in the backyard of his in-laws' house. Although my father was had very American qualities to his artwork throughout, the artist that probably had the single greatest influence on him was the Englishman, William Turner. And my father had mentioned specifically seeing a painting by Turner reproduced in a book in Ulrich's bookstore in 1939 as he was buying textbooks. And at that moment deciding that he wanted to be a painter. And this is the painting that he was talking about. This one's now at the Clark Museum in Massachusetts, titled Rockets and Blue Lights. And this is my father's compositional study of that painting. And if you'll notice, even with his note on the bottom, it said, "This made me into a painter." Saw it in a book, 1939.
Amazing.
In the 60s, the centennial of the Civil War was coming up, and my father got a grant from the Rackham Foundation to do a series of paintings on the last year of the Civil War. And his concept was to work in the style of abstract expressionism and also in the style of William Turner, to use abstraction to evoke a sense of time and place. Most of these paintings have been scattered around. The show was very successful, and the dealer that represented my father at the time, Jay Forsyth, was very good. And she was a good salesperson. So most of the paintings sold, and I don't really have reference to them. There are still a few of them in the estate. This is one of them. But I think in this painting and drawing, you can see my father's concepts of time and space and abstraction coming together. This is another one from the Civil War series that he did. He rarely did individual soldiers, but he would do masses of soldiers as a single shape, as armies moving through space in the field.
Clayton, I have a piece of his from the Civil War that I purchased at a garage sale. And when your dad saw it, I showed it to him. He goes, "My, that's a nice piece." And it has the figures in it. It is actually quite figurative.
Excellent. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Whoops, excuse me. There were several in the show that focused on Richmond, the capital and its fall as a central event in the war. These are watercolors with crayon and pencil, obviously, and also you'll notice in this one, scratches into the surface to make white marks back into the paint. This is a portrait of Ulysses Grant, done in an expressionistic style from the series. These are some of my father's best paintings, I think he believed. What I do have in the estate is some of the thumbnail sketches that were the preliminaries for these paintings, and they're absolutely wonderful. And I found a whole folder of them, and I was just thrilled. This one, 4 versions of Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, very evocative of the midsummer heat and mist of that day. Richmond burning in the distance as the Confederate Army retreats across the James River. And a sketch of a composition of Richmond, the capital built on the bones of the enslaved. And this very evocative scene titled Washington, Good Friday Eve, 1865, of course, the night that Lincoln was assassinated. The series was incomplete in my father's view. And it wasn't until the 1970s that he did the painting that he felt was the bookend, and it's this one. And this is a large acrylic on canvas. And the title of this one is Upon Passing Harper's Ferry. And this one was shown in a number of exhibits, including the Butler Museum down in Ohio. It's still part of the estate today, but one of my favorite paintings of his. Pretty much a pure abstraction, but again, the transparency and of the use of the color is very much like a watercolor technique on canvas with acrylics done on a very large scale.
How big would you say this is, Clayton?
Oh, this one is probably about 80 or 100 inches across. It's a pretty big painting. But it does have maybe a little bit of a landscape feel like the other ones, but it's, I think, more the painting of an idea. Watercolor was always central to his painting activities. Transportation, one of his favorite subjects. His paintings of trains and zeppelins are among the very best he ever did. This one was done in 1970. You might recognize the spot. This is the Ann Arbor Railroad Station. And it was based on a photo my father took in the 1940s of the Christmas special for New York City. So this represents the end of the semester and all the students clamoring to get home on board the train in the snow and the steam. And his technique is as always very spontaneous and confident. And there's an interesting use of opaque white for the mist and the steam coming from the locomotive. It's a great painting with a lot of drama and a lot of feel to it. This one hung in the family kitchen for years, so it's a very, very familiar painting. This is a Cape Cod landscape with very big, bold areas of color and wash, defined with quickly done pencil and crayon drawing. Very typical of the kind of confident style my father had, and when he's absolutely at his best. And this one is also a Cape Cod scene, much more impressionistic. Simple, beautiful use of color. Monhegan Island, a favorite vacation spot for my father and my stepmother, Garland. And there's a number of nice watercolors he did at Monhegan Island off the coast of Maine. This one is one of the best, and those artists in the crowd, and I'm sure would agree that green can be a really challenging color from an artist's point of view. But I love the range of greens in this painting, and those deep blue greens and the pine trees are very evocative. You can almost smell the pine needles in this painting, and then set off against the bright light greens in the sunshine. Really strong piece, done very quickly. I think some artists are kind of hit or miss. It's like either they hit it out of the park or they don't get it at all. And I think my father was of that type. And this was definitely one where I think he hit it out of the park. This one, I believe, came from a class assignment. It was a demonstration piece in a classroom where he would ask his students to start with a composition of almost randomly drawn straight lines and then build on that. And my father's demo, of course, turns into a William Lewis cityscape with a little bit of collage added later on. A wonderful plein air sketch done out in the American Southwest. Fantastic painting. This is a lesson in complementary contrast, right? The blues and the oranges, the opposites on the color wheel, just set each other off beautifully. This was also, I think, a class demonstration, a very simple still life of a red onion and an egg. And as simple as it is, it's enormously challenging, but I think wonderfully well done here in watercolor. So in the middle 1960s, my father started experimenting with the high viscosity acrylic paints, the Liquitex brand in particular. And he took two pieces of wood and painted an entire palette of colors on each. One of them he put on the roof of the house for a year, and then took it back down and noticed how fade resistant and durable the acrylics were. And from that point on, he never touched oils again. One of the things I'm sure he loved about the acrylics was that they were water-based. They could be done on paper in a style very similar to a watercolor, or they could be done with a thick impasto if you wanted. But most of all, what my father loved was that they were a natural fit for collage. Like other items on paper could be easily assembled with acrylic medium, which is in itself a great adhesive. This is a very early 1970s collage done in acrylic on canvas, homage to Teddy Roosevelt. And a close look, you can see that there's some magazine or newspaper pictures cut out. There's greeting cards, playing cards, postcards, all put together onto a single surface. And this appealed to my father's wit and whimsy as well. I think the combination of found images and paint. This one is also a collage, but you don't notice it right away. But there's strips of newspaper in the landscape in the foreground, as well as going up the texture of the chimney and the powerhouse in the distance. So in 1984, my father remarried to Garland Sorensen Montalvo, and it was started a very happy period in his life. They were very supportive of each other to the end. And this picture, I think, was taken at my stepbrother Carlos's wedding. But Bill and Garland were always a happy couple when together. And this is one of my favorite pictures.
Man, that seems like a long time ago.
Oh my goodness, yes. Good to have you on the call, Carlos. How you
Hey,
doing?
glad to be here. I'm at work, so I may need to bop off, but this is very interesting. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, good. Glad you could make it. This is a 1990s urban collage where it's more collage than paint, but that, you know, my father's style turned into one of assemblage, sometimes quite large. This is a large stretched canvas with huge areas of color with pieces of cardboard and paper and plain cards and postage stamps glued onto it. In the center, just a little bit off center on the upper left, is a map of the Louisiana Purchase, which I believe is the key to understanding the meaning of this painting. I think this one's about the westward expansion and all the little elements, postage stamps of Native American pottery and cut out pictures of trains and steamboats all point to westward expansion and manifest destiny, I think is the theme. So history is never far away from the contents of these pictures. Somewhere in the late 60s, my father, who was a constant sketcher, got a little more organized about how he sketched. And he started buying these black hardbound sketchbooks and keeping them with him pretty much at all times, and certainly whenever he traveled. And they started to become a visual diary. And they're wonderful. And whenever whenever my father had been traveling, one of the first things we'd want to see when he came back was, can we see the sketchbook? And there'd be page after page recreating his journeys. In this case, this was a trip my sister Susan and I both remember because we were on it, a trip to Europe and then a boat trip down the Rhine River. But there would be ballpoint pen drawings, pencil drawings, and beautiful watercolors in these sketchbooks, all done on the spot, quite spontaneously. Here's some Cape Cod scenery. (1976), I think that was the year of a hurricane while we were out on the Cape. These look like anticipation of the storm coming. And then some surprising bad weather scenes. This looks very familiar to all of us, I'm sure. Suburban Detroit in a slushy day. My father was never bored if he had his sketchbook, even if stuck in the snow, he would find something to do with his time. Barton Pond in the wintertime, another familiar looking scene. Beautiful use of the contrasting purple and brown colors. Another foggy day out on Cape Cod. And then a bright sunny day. This is a real joyous scene that I enjoy. This one's kind of an anomaly, this sort of carefully constructed and controlled watercolor. This is also a page in one of his sketchbooks. Is not the way he usually painted, but clearly he could do it if he wanted to. And I think this one has a wonderful color value demonstration. At some point, I think it must have been in the 1990s, my father gave up driving. And this was a good thing. And Garland, fortunately, was always a very competent driver and was happy to take the wheel. And this freed up my father to sketch out the car window on their cross-country trips. And his fascination for barn architecture and agricultural scenes comes through. His sketchbooks have lots of these highway views, especially in mountain passes. You know, stuck behind a train was never a bad thing for my father if he had a sketchbook handy. His sketchbooks also have compositional studies that would become larger paintings. These four landscape scenes later became a large canvas, this one here. And this was called Spring on the Plains, a large acrylic on canvas. That's the label on the back of it. And something of that Chinese brush painting still coming through many decades later in his watercolor technique in this one. This one's labeled Liberty and Maple Road, Ann Arbor. This one was done out an airplane window at 6 in the morning, landing at Lisbon, Spain, painting out the airplane window. Who does that? Well, Bill Lewis did. This isn't the only example I've seen of a view out an airplane window in his sketchbooks. This from the same trip on the ground a few days later in Zaragoza. A beautiful wet on wet technique. So the story in the family is that when my father turned 90, he asked Garland, you know, what are you going to be doing for the next 10 years? And he had in mind a project, and that was to gather together the paintings that he had done over the decades related to the subject of World War I. And he wanted to add to it. He felt like that this was something he was compelled to do. And it comes from his boyhood conversations with his uncles who were World War I veterans, particularly his mother's brother, Uncle Heine, who lived a very long time, but was gassed and shell shocked in the Argonne forest, and was never quite the same, but was a member of the family and came over for holidays on a regular basis at our Ann Arbor house. And this would be my father's last big project, was Fragments of the Great War. And the River Gallery in Chelsea represented him at that time. And at the front end of the series was this one that we saw earlier from 1955, a scene of trench warfare. And from the 1960s, this terrific portrait of German General von Ludendorff, done with almost a Rembrandt-esque style and confidence. And then some of the later works he did include this one, a Zeppelin attack on Britain, an overturning battleship. As horrific as the subject matter is, the execution is just incredible. And the cost of the war in human terms is never forgotten in my father's work. And in times it's very personal. This painting is in homage to his father's young brother, Wilfred, who died in the last weeks of the war, and collaged together with a copy of the letter that was sent to the family announcing his death. Bill Lewis pretty much had stopped painting by 2015, 2016. His eyesight was frustrating him, and he wasn't getting the results that he wanted, but he was pleased with this one, and it's certainly a great evocative nature scene. This was done about 2015, and among the last paintings that he did. My father liked to make lists, and in cleaning out his studio, I found a number of lists. This one is a list of fields where he felt he had some expertise, and it includes everything from ancient Roman and Greek history to the history of photography, military history, astronomy, space flight, Chinese painting, Flemish painting. It's an amazing list. And he wasn't exaggerating to say that this was something where he could teach on these subjects at the drop of a hat. This photo is taken by Lon Horwedel, who is an Ann Arbor News photographer and is now freelancing. And it's a great picture of my father, done about the time of the Fragments of the Great War exhibit going up in 2015, in his very familiar blue sweatshirt and denim apron, in his studio, at his drawing table in his studio, with a sable watercolor brush in his hand. And it was going through the papers on this table after he died that I came across this, and I about fell over. Someday, son, these will all be yours, I'm afraid. But I'm proud to inherit his legacy. So what about me? I went to art school in Massachusetts and New York. And this is a cityscape I did years ago in New York. Urban landscapes are a favorite subject in New York in particular. This is a little oil sketch. My father liked to work big. I tend to work small. This is another New York oil sketch of Brooklyn Bridge composition. I will admit to stealing a lot of my best ideas from my dad. Times Square at night. Not my favorite neighborhood in New York, but it sure is picturesque for a painter.
Mm-hmm.
I do watercolors as well, often as preliminaries for other paintings, like this one done on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which led to an oil painting of Fifth Avenue. And this is one of the larger paintings I've done. This is a canvas of what is now the Hudson Yards complex. These the buildings in the foreground in this painting are all gone now and replaced with that gargantuan complex now at Hudson Yards.
How big is this, Clayton?
This one is, I think, about 3 or 4 feet across.
Okay.
This is an acrylic. I've started experimenting with the acrylics and this one's on gessoed masonite. And a watercolor of Detroit over on the east side of Detroit. I was pleased the Ann Arbor City Club bought this one from me. They have a nice collection, by the way. The Ann Arbor City Club on Washtenaw Avenue has collected local artists for a long time, and they've got some money to spend, and they've got a really wonderful collection. A couple of nice things of my father's in there, along with many other excellent local artists. We had a great hotel balcony a few years ago when we were in Florence, and I was reluctant to leave the balcony. The view was so good, so I did a few sketches there. This is an oil painting done later after we returned home, based on some of the sketches I did from that balcony. The Charles River in Boston and the bridge to Cambridge late in the day. Did this one a couple years ago. Barton Hills Forest on a cold fall day. This is an oil inspired by the Hartwick Pines forest up near Grayling, the old growth pine forest. And my son Max spent some time in California, and we loved going out to visit him. He worked as a naturalist in a school that was in a redwood forest, and that was always spectacular for sketching. And Northern California coast near Jenner. And Point Reyes, the fog coming in off the ocean at Point Reyes in California. And this is turned into an unfinished oil painting here. And Cape Cod, we still like to go on vacation out there. The fog was rolling in. I started this painting, and like within 10 minutes, I couldn't see 10 feet. Playing with the acrylic paints on black paper. That's something different. After all these years of painting on white paper, using the opaqueness of the acrylics on black paper. Moonlit watercolor, Cape Cod Bay. And a foggy seaside oil painting. And this is a cottage we like to rent in oil. And this one is from last summer, also out on Cape Cod. Most recently, I've been doing some paintings based on famous historical photographs. This is a famous photo by the photographer Carl Strauss, who was a Hollywood cinematographer, but also part of Stieglitz's gallery in New York. And my father had this original print of this photo in his collection, and I used it as the basis for a painting. And same with this one. This is based on an 1860s photo taken in Egypt by Francis Frith that I've used as sort of the launching point for an oil painting. If you're not familiar with the Michigan Art Gallery in Ypsilanti on Michigan Avenue, the west side of town, there's a lot of great Michigan artists represented there, including my father. They've got a number of his works, some really terrific ones. Some of the ones you've seen today are out at the Michigan Art Gallery. They're on the property of Schmidt's Antiques, that's been in business for generations, and they seem to be a reputable business, and I highly recommend going out there and checking them out. They have ceramics as well from Michigan artists, as well as paintings.
We purchased a Kingsley Calkins there.
on my website, lewisgallery.com.
That's great. No, that
And that's what I
gallery,
got. I would be happy to take any questions if anyone's got any questions or comments or stories they'd like to tell.
now Clayton, this was awesome. Seeing your dad's work chronologically, and seeing, I could see so many influences from from famous artists like a Winslow Homer, or I had another piece here, but I just saw just a lot of influences from the 40s, 30s, and 40s of the artists of that time in his work. And now it's pretty amazing. And, you know, your work looked awesome as well. I mean, if people haven't seen your work before, that's just great stuff.
Well, thank you. But
Tell-
like I said, I've stolen all my good ideas from my dad. So.
Tell us what your role is now at Clements.
I'm the curator of their visual materials. The Clements is a research library for American history and culture that's got a terrific collection of lithographs, engravings, photographs, and some original art, including watercolors that are documentary evidence of American history. And it's not really a fine art collection, but it's a beautiful collection. And it includes things like political cartoons and satires. Certainly some of the famous Currier and Ives prints you've probably seen, but it also includes things like soldiers' sketches from, I think we have soldiers' sketches from the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, including my father's US Navy sketches, which when he decided to donate those, we were thrilled because they just fit right in place with the rest.
You know, I saw some of your dad's work at the gallery you just mentioned, but I didn't know who he was at the time when I was looking at it. But I did buy a piece from my mentor and head of the art department at Eastern, Kingsley Calkins. I found a piece there, and I called up his daughter, who lives in Seattle, who's the person responsible for his collection. And I said, well, I just bought one of your dad's. But if anybody has any questions, put it in the chat, or I can unmute you and you can ask Clayton directly.
I see one in the chat from Chris, who's asking about the date on the back of one of the paintings. I think that said, yeah, 1991 to 2009. Yes, he often went back and reworked older paintings, and if he might then update the date on the painting on the back. So it's possible that there's a painting that had a date range of a couple of decades.
It's funny today when you're in galleries or in general, they don't want you to put dates on, because if they see that it was done 10 years ago, it must be old, and which is kind of stupid. But a lot of artists just don't put dates on anymore because they feel, well, it hasn't sold yet, so I don't want to buy it, or whatever the concept is. But I always loved looking at dates, and I think from an artist perspective, it helps you feel, how productive was I this year, or this week, or this month, and putting the dates down kind of help. But I guess you can put it on the back, or I keep a separate list on a spreadsheet of when I did something, so I know. But any other questions? This was someone's trying to get on. Let's see. Someone new's coming on.
Okay, she'll be on.
Hey, John, he muted himself. Okay. Well, Clayton, this was awesome. I really appreciate you doing this for the Michigan Watercolor Society. And I appreciate our members that are on this call, as well as looks like a lot of your family, which is great too. So
That's right. Family and friends, and some of them are artistically inclined in a big way too.
Well, I tell galleries when I have a show in the area that I'll guarantee that I'll have at least 50 people from that are related to me show up to the show. So you'll have an audience. Well, thanks again. This will be recorded, And for members that are on the call, you'll see a recording coming from me. It'll be on our YouTube channel for Michigan Watercolor Society. Clayton, I'll send you that link as well so that you can share it with anyone that would like to see this as well, or share it with the family. It'll be
I
available.
appreciate that very much. Thank you. I'm glad to hear you've got a YouTube channel.
So
I'm sure Sister Julia will be anxious to see it.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I'm glad you made it on board.
It was fabulous, Clayton. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
okay, and with that, I think we will close this down, and our next Zoom call will be next month. I can't remember what the date is. I think it's the second week in April, and it's with a company, a nonprofit Ann Arbor called Cultureverse. And they've taken, they've got some, again, it's technology, where they'll take images of a gallery and create a virtual gallery. And if you're friends with me, you'll see that I've done it with them. They came to my gallery and studio and virtualized it, if you will, and you can move around the gallery, you can click on a painting, whatever. And they're in downtown Ann Arbor, and they're all about combining the arts with virtual reality and that kind of thing. So they're right on Main Street. I forget the address, but we're going to have them talk to us with Michigan Watercolor, and maybe we can set up a gallery of our 75th annual exhibition that will be happening in June. And that way people can just don't have to worry about going to a specific gallery. They can do it online and see their work and that kind of thing as well. So with that, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Go Tigers.
Thanks.
See ya.
Wonderful.